The rain in Manhattan didn't fall. It shattered against the pavement. Inside the glass-walled atrium of the Pierre Hotel, the air smelled of lilies and $500 an ounce perfume. Caleb Sterling stood at the center of a circle of sharks. He was 42, wore a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and possessed eyes that looked like they had been carved from North Atlantic ice. He was discussing the demolition of a low-income housing block in Brooklyn. "Efficiency is the only metric that matters," Caleb said, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling?" The voice was tiny. It shouldn't have been able to pierce the roar of the gala, but it did. Caleb looked down. Standing amidst the silk dresses and patent leather shoes was a boy. He was drenched. His oversized yellow raincoat was slick with NYC grime, and he was clutching a red plastic toolbox to his chest as if it were made of solid gold. "Who let a child in here?" Caleb's assistant, Marcus, stepped forward, his hand already reaching for his phone to call security. "I have a permit," the boy said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, wet piece of paper. It wasn't a permit. It was a drawing of a building, Caleb's latest skyscraper. Caleb raised a hand, stopping Marcus. Something about the boy's eyes, wide, hazel, and rimmed with a terrifying level of exhaustion, made Caleb's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt since he was a cadet. "What do you want, kid?" Caleb asked, his voice losing its predatory edge. "My name is Leo," the boy said. His lip quivered, but he stood his ground. "My dad said if the world ever fell down, I should find the man who builds the strongest things. He said you build things that never break." Caleb felt a cold shiver. "Your father has good taste in architecture." "Where is he?" Leo looked down at his muddy sneakers. "He's in the ground. He fell down so you didn't have to." The room went silent. The sharks backed away. Caleb felt a ghost of a memory, a screaming siren, the sound of grinding steel, and a man in a hard hat shoving Caleb into a reinforced concrete crawlspace just as the floor above them gave way. Caleb had never learned the man's name. He had let his lawyers handle the settlements. "Is it true?" Leo asked, a single tear cutting a track through the dirt on his cheek. "Can you fix things?" He held up the red toolbox. "I have my tools. But I don't know how to fix a heart that stopped. Mommy's heart stopped this morning. She's still on the couch. She's cold, Mr. Sterling. Can you make her warm?" Caleb didn't call the police. He didn't call social services, not yet. He walked out of his own $10,008 plate gala, leaving the mayor and the investor standing in the atrium. He followed the boy into the dark, rain-swept streets of a part of the city Caleb usually only saw from a helicopter. They reached a crumbling walk-up in Queens. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. Inside the tiny apartment, the reality of poverty hit Caleb like a physical blow. There was no furniture, only crates. And on the sofa lay a woman, her face peaceful but pale. She had been gone for hours. Caleb knelt. He didn't care about his silk trousers. He didn't care about the grime. He looked at Leo, who was opening his plastic toolbox and pulling out a toy wrench. "I tried to tighten the bolts," Leo whispered. "But she won't wake up." Caleb reached out. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't reach out to sign a contract or shake a hand. He reached out to pull a grieving child into his chest. "Leo," Caleb said, his voice breaking, "some things can't be fixed with tools. But I promise you, you are never going to be cold again." The sirens arrived 20 minutes later, but they didn't wail. They pulsed low and red against the peeling wallpaper of the apartment. Caleb didn't move from the floor. He sat on the threadbare rug, Leo's head resting against his shoulder. The boy had finally fallen into a shallow, twitching sleep, his fingers still hooked into the handle of that red plastic toolbox. When the paramedics entered, they stopped short. They recognized Caleb Sterling. His face was on the cover of every business journal in the city. Seeing him in a crumbling Queens walk-up, cradling a child while covered in dust and grief, was like seeing a statue bleed. "Mr. Sterling?" one of the EMTs asked, his voice hushed. "Do it quietly," Caleb commanded, his voice a gravelly whisper. "He just closed his eyes. Don't let the first thing he sees be a black bag." They respected his silence. As they moved Leo's mother, Caleb felt the boy stir. Leo's eyes fluttered open, catching the glint of the brass buttons on an officer's uniform. Panic flared in his hazel eyes. "Are they taking her to the hospital to make her warm?" Leo asked, his voice rising. Caleb looked at the lead officer, a man named Miller, who looked like he'd seen too many nights like this. Miller shook his head almost imperceptibly. Caleb turned back to Leo. He didn't offer a lie. "No, Leo. They're taking her to a place where she can rest. But you're coming with me. Is that allowed?" Leo asked, the same haunting question from the first story. "I don't have a ticket." "I own the train, Leo," Caleb said, standing up and hoisting the boy into his arms. "You don't need a ticket." The Sterling penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel perched 60 stories above Park Avenue. It was a place of white marble and silent air conditioning, a place where the shadows felt expensive. When the elevator doors slid open, Caleb's housekeeper, Elena, gasping at the sight of him. Caleb was drenched, his $4,000 loafers ruined by mud, carrying a shivering child who looked like a soot-stained orphan from another century. "Prepare the blue guest suite," Caleb ordered. "And find me a doctor. A private one. Now!" "Sir, the board of directors has been calling every 30 seconds," Elena whispered, her eyes wide. "They say the gala was a disaster. They say the Brooklyn Project is. The Brooklyn Project is a pile of dirt," Caleb snapped. "Tell the board that the chairman is busy." He carried Leo to a bathroom larger than the boy's entire kitchen. He filled a tub with warm water. Leo sat on the edge of the porcelain, staring at the gold-plated faucets. "Mr. Sterling?" "Yes, Leo. Is this heaven?" Caleb paused, a sponge in his hand. He looked at his own reflection in the mirror, a man who had spent 40 years building walls and burning bridges. "No, Leo. It's just a house. But it's yours for as long as you need it. Mommy said houses are for families," Leo said, testing the water with a toe. "Are we a family now?" Caleb's heart, usually a cold, efficient pump, gave a painful thud. "We're two people who have been alone for a long time." Maybe that's the same thing. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the sharks had gathered. Caleb's office was at the top of the Sterling Tower, and 3 of his top investors were already there, pacing the floor. "You walked out on the mayor, Caleb!" Arthur, the oldest board member, shouted. "The press is calling. There are photos of you in a slum. They're saying you've had a breakdown." Caleb sat behind his desk of polished obsidian. He hadn't slept. He was wearing a fresh suit, but his eyes were different. They weren't looking at the stock tickers on the wall. They were looking at a small, red plastic toolbox sitting on his desk. "I found the son of Thomas Miller," Caleb said quietly. The room went dead silent. Arthur's face paled. "The engineer? From the Fifth Avenue collapse?" "Caleb, we settled that. The NDA was ironclad. Why would you bring that back up?" "Because Thomas Miller didn't sign an NDA," Caleb said, his voice rising like a coming storm. "He signed his life away to shove me into a corner while the ceiling came down. And yesterday, his son asked me if I could fix a heart that stopped. I told him I build things that never break. It was a lie, Arthur. I've been building fragile things my whole life. What are you saying? I'm canceling the Brooklyn demolition, Caleb said. We're going to retrofit the existing buildings. We're going to build a community center. And I'm taking legal guardianship of the boy. You'll be removed as CEO, Arthur hissed. This is a breach of fiduciary duty. Then remove me, Caleb said, standing up. But I'm keeping the toolbox. Weeks passed. The penthouse, once a tomb of silence, began to change. There were cereal boxes on the marble counters. There were toy trucks parked under the Picasso in the hallway. But Leo didn't play like other children. He spent hours by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking at the city below. He always kept his red toolbox within reach. One evening, a storm rolled in. Lightning cracked over the Hudson River. Caleb found Leo hiding in the back of a closet, clutching his toolbox so hard his knuckles were white. Leo? What's wrong? The thunder, Leo whispered. It sounds like the building is falling again. That's what it sounded like when Daddy didn't come home. The world is breaking, Mr. Sterling. I can hear it. Caleb crawled into the closet. He didn't care about the tight space or the indignity of a billionaire sitting on a pile of shoes. He pulled Leo into his lap. I have a secret, Leo, Caleb whispered. I was there that day. With your dad. Leo froze. You were? Yes. He was the bravest man I ever met. He told me to keep moving. He told me that even when things fall down, we have to keep building. He didn't just save my life, Leo. He gave me a job. He told me to look after the things that matter. Did he tell you to look after me? Caleb felt a tear, a real, hot tear, hit his cheek. He didn't have to. I think he knew I'd find you. 6 months later, the legal battle was over. Caleb had stepped down as CEO of Sterling Developments to form the Miller Foundation. They stood on a plot of land in Brooklyn, not a demolition site, but a garden. Caleb held a shovel. Leo held his toy wrench. Mr. Michael, I mean Caleb? Leo asked. Yeah, kid. Are we going to leave now? Caleb looked at the boy. Leo wasn't drenched anymore. He looked healthy, his cheeks full, his eyes bright. But the fear of the exit was still there. It's the trauma of the orphan, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Caleb knelt in the dirt, the same way he had in the cemetery in Queens. He took a small, gold key from his pocket and put it in Leo's hand. This is the key to the new house we're building here, Caleb said. And the one on Park Avenue. And the one in the mountains. Every door I own, Leo, is a door you can walk through. I'm not leaving. I've finally started building something that's actually permanent. Leo looked at the key, then at Caleb. He didn't ask for a hug this time. He just leaned in and pressed his forehead against Caleb's shoulder. Good, Leo whispered, because I still have a lot of things to fix. Caleb smiled, looking up at the NYC skyline. For the first time, he didn't see a grid of profit. He saw a city of people, each one a life, each one a story. And as the sun broke through the clouds, he knew the debt wasn't just paid, it was the start of a whole new ledger. The peace of the new foundation was short-lived. Caleb had stepped down, but the sharks he had trained for decades weren't finished with him. A month after the groundbreaking in Brooklyn, Caleb received a formal summons. The board was suing him for misuse of corporate funds. During the final weeks of his leadership, specifically, the millions he had diverted into a trust for Leo and the construction of the community center. They want to take the house, Caleb, Julian, his biological son, said as he walked into the penthouse. Julian had been staying in the guest room across from Leo, and for the first time in years, the tension between father and son had thawed. "They're going after everything. They want to prove you're mentally unfit so they can void the Miller Foundation contracts." Caleb sat at his desk, but he wasn't looking at legal briefs. He was watching Leo in the living room. The boy was trying to fix a broken remote control with a plastic screwdriver from his red toolbox. "Let them try," Caleb said, his jaw tight. "I spent 20 years learning how to destroy people in a courtroom. If they want a war, I'll give them one." "It's not just a legal war, Dad," Julian said, dropping a tabloid on the desk. The headline screamed, "Sterling's shame. Billionaire's obsession with orphan leads to corporate ruin." "They're attacking Leo's privacy. They're calling the boy a prop for your midlife crisis." Caleb's hand gripped the edge of the desk until we groaned. It was one thing to attack a man. It was another to attack the child who had finally started to stop flinching at loud noises. The deposition took place in a sterile, white-walled room on the 40th floor of a midtown law firm. Arthur sat across from Caleb, flanked by 3 lawyers who looked like they were carved from granite. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur began, his voice dripping with false concern, "we all admire your charity. But the fact remains that you shifted $4 million of shareholder money into a private trust for a child you met in a hallway. A child with no legal connection to you." "His father saved my life," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "A noble sentiment. But in the eyes of the law, that's a past consideration, which doesn't justify a gift of that magnitude. We are asking for the return of the funds and your resignation from all foundation boards." Caleb leaned forward. "And if I refuse? Then we depose the boy," Arthur said smoothly. "We ask him about the night his mother died. We ask him about the inducements you offered him." "We'll make it very public, Caleb. The press will have a field day with the poor little orphan story." The silence in the room was absolute. Caleb felt a cold, murderous rage, but then he felt something else. A tug on his sleeve. Leo had been sitting in the waiting room with Elena, but the door hadn't been fully latched. He stood there now, clutching his red toolbox. He looked small against the towering glass windows behind him. "Mr. Arthur?" Leo asked. Arthur sneered. "Someone get this child out of—" "I don't want the money," Leo said. He walked to the table and set the red plastic toolbox on the polished mahogany. It looked absurd next to the expensive laptops and legal pads. "If you take the money, will you stop being mean to Mr. Caleb?" Caleb stood up. "Leo, go back outside." "No," Leo said, his voice shaking but clear. He looked at Arthur. "My dad told me that tools are for building things, not for hurting people." "You're using your words like hammers, but you're hitting the wrong thing." Leo opened the toolbox. He pulled out the toy wrench, the one he had used to try and wake up his mother. He pushed it across the table toward Arthur. "You look like you're hurting too," Leo said with a child's terrifying intuition. "You're old and you have a big table, but no one is sitting with you. You can have my wrench. Maybe it can fix your heart, so you don't have to be mean anymore." Arthur looked down at the plastic toy. The room, filled with some of the most expensive lawyers in New York, stayed silent. The sensory contrast was sharp. The smell of expensive leather, and the sight of a $1 plastic toy on a $50,000 table. For a second, Arthur's mask slipped. He looked at the toy, then at the boy, then at Caleb, who was standing protectively behind Leo. "This is highly irregular," Arthur stammered, his face turning a deep, embarrassed red. "The deposition is over," Caleb said. He picked up the plastic wrench and handed it back to Leo, then turned to Arthur. "If you ever mention this boy's name again, I won't just fight you in court. I'll spend every penny I have left to buy your firm, your house, and the very air you breathe, just to make sure you never work in this city again. Do you understand?" Arthur didn't say a word. He looked at the floor. As they walked out of the building, the NYC sun was setting, turning the skyscrapers into pillars of fire. Caleb felt a sense of lightness he hadn't known was possible. He had lost millions in the settlement that followed, but he didn't care. A year later, the Miller Community Center was finished. It wasn't a glass tower. It was a warm, brick building with a playground that echoed with the sounds of children from the neighborhood. Caleb sat on a bench, watching Leo. The boy was no longer clutching the toolbox as a shield. Instead, he was using it to help a younger girl repair a sandbox castle. Julian sat down next to his father. "You look different, Dad." "I am different," Caleb said. "I used to think that to be successful, you had to build things that stood over people. I was wrong. You have to build things that hold people up." Leo ran over, breathless, his face smeared with dirt and happiness. "Caleb! Look! I fixed the gate. It doesn't squeak anymore." Caleb pulled the boy into a hug, a real, messy, unrestrained hug. He didn't care about the dirt on his shirt. He didn't care about the time. "Good job, Leo," Caleb whispered into the boy's hair. "You're the best builder I know." "We're a good team," Leo said, leaning his weight into Caleb. "The best," Caleb agreed. As the sun set over Brooklyn, the billionaire who had once had everything and the boy who had once lost it all stood together. They weren't just a story anymore. They were a foundation. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Sterling knew that he wasn't just paying a debt. He was finally, truly, building a home. 10 years had passed since the day the Shark of Manhattan became the father of Brooklyn. Caleb Sterling sat in his high-back leather chair, but he wasn't in a skyscraper. He was in his study at home. His breathing was shallow, his hair a shock of white. Beside him sat Leo, now 17, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the same steady gaze his father, Thomas Miller, once had. "Leo," Caleb whispered, his hand trembling as he reached for a locked drawer in his desk. "It's time." Leo watched as Caleb pulled out a weathered, manila envelope. It was dated 5 years before the construction accident that killed Leo's father. "Everyone thinks I saved you because of a debt from that day at the construction site," Caleb said, a tear tracing a deep wrinkle on his face. "But there is something the lawyers buried. Something I've buried for 17 years. Leo opened the envelope. Inside were medical records and a signed release of liability. Leo's eyes scanned the documents. His breath hitched. The records weren't about the construction site collapse. They were from a private clinic. "My mother," Leo's voice broke. "The heart condition? It wasn't just bad luck, Leo," Caleb whispered, looking at the floor in shame. 17 years ago, your mother was a lead researcher at one of my pharmaceutical subsidiaries. She discovered that a new miracle drug we were pushing was causing heart valve failure. She tried to whistleblow. I didn't listen to the sharks. I signed the order to discredit her, to fire her, and to ensure she could never work in medicine again." Leo dropped the papers. The room felt ice cold. "I broke her heart long before it stopped beating." Caleb sobbed, falling to his knees, the same way he had in the mud years ago. "I destroyed her life to protect my profit. Then, years later, your father saved me from that collapse, not knowing I was the man who had ruined his wife. When I saw you at that gala, Leo, I wasn't just paying a debt. I was trying to buy back my soul from a woman I had already killed." The silence in the room was deafening. Leo looked at the red plastic toolbox sitting on the bookshelf, the toy he had used to try and fix his mother's heart. He realized now that the man he called Dad was the reason her heart needed fixing in the first place. Leo stood up. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply picked up the red toolbox. "You built a foundation on a graveyard, Caleb," Leo said, his voice cold and hollow. Leo walked to the door. He paused, looking back at the broken billionaire kneeling on the rug. "My mom said some people help by saving lives, and some people help later," Leo whispered, repeating the words that had started it all. "But she never said what to do when the person helping you is the one who took everything away." The door clicked shut. Caleb Sterling was left alone in the golden light of a penthouse bought with the blood of the woman he had tried to replace. He reached out for a hug that would never come again. Was it true redemption, or just an expensive apology? If you believe some things can never be forgiven, comment "Justice" below. Don't forget to subscribe to Pub Stories for more truths that hurt.